Futurologist, keynote speaker and respected global scenario planner is Clem Sunter. His accuracy in predicting the future of reading what he calls the flags, warnings of possible scenarios, had him interviewed by the powers that be in the States when he predicted, together with his co-author, the possible scenario of 9/11 in New York. Now, he urges us to think like the bright-eyed fox, and he is most certainly a man worth listening to. Clem is on the line from Somerset West. Welcome to you, Clem. How are you?
Fine, thanks, Tamara. And we've had welcome rains,
Yes.
and so we're all in a much happier mood. And of course, there have been some terrible tragedies,
Yes.
Both with the rains and the terrible fires in Neisner. But
Yes.
gee whiz, we did need those rains.
You did. I was down there a few weeks ago, and I have to say it was sort of desolation city, wasn't it? Terrible.
Yeah.
Well, there's one scenario. There's a great deal going on in the world. We are hooked on the news. Certainly I am, in a way. I was always interested, but I'm hooked on it in a sort of there's a morbid fascination, for instance, during the whole Trump-Clinton election, which had us turning on the news the minute we awoke. And that sort of endorphin rush was measurable. Brexit, unemployment, posturing, climate change, broken promises. There's so many of your flags to watch out for. When you look at what's going on around the world, what is going to be of most impact on us here on the continent of Africa, do you think?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the flags, and then, obviously the consequences for Africa.
Yeah.
The one with Chantal Ilbury and I, who co-authored The Mind of a Fox,
Yes.
really had as our first flag defining this century was the religious flag. And yes, you're quite right. We actually wrote a formal letter to George Bush in the book, in which we said that part of his legacy as a fox would be to see the flags that might lead to major risks to the United States, and an attack on a major city in America could well happen. Obviously, we couldn't say that it would happen 3 months after we published the book, or indeed that it would happen in New York. But the whole point of flags is to get a feel for the events that could happen, and therefore obviously be more aware of the evidence leading up to an event. And I'm afraid to say they weren't in that case. And
Yes.
of course, the recent attacks in Manchester and London have indicated that it's still very high on the mast, and you've got to have a much better intelligence gathering system, because you're fighting against an informal network rather than a formal military enemy.
Yeah.
And so, it is bad. And of course, in Africa, you do have, in North Africa, signs of this flag going up the mast in places like Somalia and Mali. We're blessed in South Africa that we talk a lot about race and black and white, but we don't talk about religion here. So, we are very tolerant, and it is one huge positive for our society.
No, you do make a very good point there. I suppose, when there's chatter on the airwaves about bombs, people, there are flags that are much more easily detected than somebody renting a van and buying a few carving knives. It's one of those things where, unless there's a great deal of social media or chatter that they can pick up, it's very difficult to predict somebody doing what has been done on both Westminster Bridge and on London Bridge, isn't it?
Yeah, but you see, and it's something that MI5, particularly, and MI6, but particularly MI5, which looks after the internal security of Britain, they should be sitting down and coming up with a collection of flags which, are then increasing the probability of somebody who is, a religious ideologue turning into a terrorist.
Yes.
And I don't know whether they've done that, but, when you look at these last couple of events in Manchester and London, there were quite a few flags associated with each of those individuals. And it kind of got lost because as the head of intelligence say, we can't recruit another 30 or 40,000 intelligent agents, but the whole point of intelligence is to be really intelligent, and
yes.
they must actually come up with a set of flags. When an individual goes beyond that, then they either have to wear tags or they have to be traced.
Yeah.
But they've got to do something in terms of deciding what the very specific flags are to turn somebody into a threat.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's that fine line, actually not such a fine line anymore, between the rule of law of individual human rights, of not being found guilty unless you've actually done something, and that whole mixed up question as to whether you should actually incarcerate somebody because you think they're about to do something, which you obviously in Great Britain can't do.
Yeah, and I agree with that. You can't incarcerate them, but you can track them. Yes. And, you've got to come up with responses in terms of, so that you don't infringe the normal liberties of a democracy, but you've got to come up with those responses which are appropriate for the level of threat. And, when Theresa May says, well, we're going to tear up the European Union law on human rights in terms of the future fight, I don't think that's the way to go. You've got to think of very specific responses that the intelligence agencies can take in terms of tracking those individuals. And yes, you will probably break some of the laws on telephones and freedom of the internet and all those things, but you've got to find the balance. Yeah.
We talk about flags with you, but when you look at the result of the election that's just been announced, this sort of hung result between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and Theresa May was forecast to have a landslide victory. Indeed, is quite possibly why she called it when she did, in order to go forward to roll out whatever plans of Great Britain's exit from Brexit. What flags do you see as a result of what we see this morning, what we've woken up to?
Well, Tamara, it's quite interesting. We had a flag which we identified 4 years ago called the anti-establishment flag, and we basically said that what has happened is that since the financial crash of 2007, we've seen the super rich getting even richer because the markets have recovered and property prices are rising. But for your average person in the middle class who's most reliant on their salaries and obviously workers on their wages, there's been absolutely no improvement since then in real terms. In fact, wages have gone up even less than inflation. And so there's this huge anger towards the political establishment. And when I wrote the book Flag Watching in November 2015, I mentioned both Trump was a beneficiary of this flag because he's seen as a Washington outsider. I mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders as beneficiaries. And of course it has produced three consequences: the election of Trump, Brexit, and now the hung parliament. And I honestly don't know how the hung parliament is going to be resolved other than a formation of a national government. There was one during the Second World War. The Brexit decision is such a huge decision that you can't basically negotiate with a thin majority. Theresa May was right about that, but of course she was wrong about the outcome. And personally, I believe the only way they can go forward is to have a national government negotiating the terms of Brexit, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, it'll be very interesting. Do you think, putting you on the spot, do you think Brexit is a good thing?
No. I think it goes against the trend of globalization, which is, lots of UK companies have exported into Europe and London. A lot of the banks have actually serviced their clients in Europe from London. So to me, it was it was actually not a good decision. Maybe in 5 years' time, Italy and Greece and other countries may be in real financial difficulties, which will put large strains on the European Union.
Yes.
But in the immediate future, for me, it's crazy to pull out of the largest economy on earth, because the European Union is actually larger than America if you look at the dollar size of the Europe. So. No, it wasn't a good decision.
No. Interesting that you say that. Clem, we're going to go to a piece of music. It's by Frédéric Chopin. We're going to quickly go into traffic. So would you mind staying on the line?
Absolutely.
Thank you. This traffic report was brought to you by cartrip.co.za, affordable and flexible ride sharing. Well, if you have just tuned in, I'm chatting to Clem Sunter this morning. He's a futurologist, keynote speaker. He's an author. He's also a respected global scenario planner. And we're looking at, South Africa and I suppose, and the global economy. But Clem, can we just look at what's happening in terms of a population? I was worried about how we're going to feed everybody, and is there going to be enough water for everyone, and what about climate change? And then we hear about Europe and particularly Japan as having this population implosion, which sort of should be good, shouldn't it? And is completely opposite to what's going on in Africa. What's going to play out here?
Well, the UN have provided a projection of what the population will be in 2100. It'll be 11.2 billion. And of that, 83% will either be Asian or African. Okay. It just gives you a feel for how the complexion of the world's population is going to change over the next, 50 years. Yes. And, of course, the fastest growing populations are in Africa. Europe and Japan, in fact, have fairly stagnant populations, and they're aging very fast, which is bringing big issues up like healthcare. America's slightly younger, but again, healthcare is a huge issue because there's an aging population there.
Yes.
The Chinese have just gone from a one-child to a two-child policy because they see the effects of the one-child policy, which is their population has become middle-aged, not as old as Japan, but middle-aged, with very much fewer younger people. And yes, the whole kind of composition of the global demographic is changing in front of our eyes, which means that Europe and Japan have flat economies. They probably will never grow again. They'll just be flat. America will continue to grow at a low rate. And in Africa and South America, where governments are good, they will just grow their economies much faster than the rest because, young people purchase a lot more than old people.
Yes, but are they going to be able to? Because when we look at the, the population explosion here, or in terms of the ages of the under 20s here, and the unemployment that we have, and the lack of education, the lack of growth, indeed, that's been pointed to in terms of junk status and where we are heading. What is that going to mean to this country?
Yeah, very interesting tomorrow, because I talk about sort of flags operating in conjunction with one another, and you've got the green flag, which of climate change,
yes.
And one just doesn't know what the planet's going to be like in the second half of the century. I was talking to America's top futurist 2 weekends ago. He's based in Palo Alto, California, and he was saying that the tipping point on the global climate has actually passed.
Has it?
Now, I've never thought that. I've thought it was somewhere around about 2040, but he says we're going to experience very savage extremities of weather over the next 100 years. And that obviously can have an impact on population, extreme drought or extreme rainfall. So, that's the one flag. The second one, obviously, which you referred to, is technology is destroying jobs,
yes.
And artificial intelligence will continue that particular trend, and I refer to that as a flag. So my point in South Africa is we want to make a dent on our appalling unemployment rate and go back into positive territory on economic growth. the entire emphasis of the government should be on creating an environment which is favorable for entrepreneurs and small business. It is the number one issue in South Africa. And I've called for an economic cadastre so that we can actually get buy-in from big business and the other major players in this country, because there is no other way of creating work. So you're right. We can have high economic growth rates here, but we've obviously got to be sensitive to our environment as best we can. Obviously, we can't change the climate, because that's a worldwide concern. But the second thing is we've got to have a huge drive towards creating a new generation of entrepreneurs and actually trying to find a way of creating a proper economy where all the township economies are integrated in the mainstream economies, and we move away from, I'm afraid to say, economic apartheid, which we still have, despite the fact that we're a political democracy.
Interesting. Surely this growth of entrepreneurial spirit, if you like, would come from education, which is a sort of longer look at the whole process. It's what happens in between. You know, we need more teachers. We need more educated people who have a right, surely, to education. And it's that's going to, because I do think that South Africans seem to be, for whatever reasons we want to point at, naturally entrepreneurial.
Yeah, and to be honest, we have some of the best schools in the world, so we already have them here. But they tend to be private schools.
Yes.
And it's just such a shame that we aren't looking at our pockets of excellence in education and saying, how can we replicate those pockets of excellence? What we have is a lot of schools which get the money, so it's not a money problem, but they simply aren't properly managed, and the principals are not that good. I've said for a long time the principal variable of a school is the principal, and if you have quality principals, then you actually get good schools. So I'd like to see a principals academy established in South Africa, because we've always said education is the number one condition for a winning nation. So it applies at from the age of 2 through to the age of 21. You're going to have all levels of education as best you can.
Yeah. Clem, we're going to go to a piece of music, and it's by Mozart. It's a Symphony No. 7 in D major, K45. Do stay on the line. O'clock. You're tuned in to Classic FM 102.7, and I'm chatting to Clem Sunter about world affairs, really, I think, and what's happening today in the world are throwing up what we should be looking out for. And Clem, I have to say that the fact that we're past the point of no return, and that there's no mention of this magic 2 degrees that we should avoid at all costs, because then we're going to hit the tipping point in terms of climate change, is rather scary.
It's very scary, and it absolutely blew me away.
Yeah.
But one of the points that he made was that all the Paris Accord did was limit the growth of carbon emissions. It didn't actually level them or cause them to reduce.
Yes.
And so he said on the current trends, we're already seeing very extreme weather, which he saw in California, where they had 4 years of drought, followed by spectacular rainfalls at the beginning of this year, 1 in 500-year rainfalls at the beginning of this year, which has broken the drought. But that's what he says. You're going to see these very extreme weather patterns, like we've experienced in the Cape with a drought and then extreme, rainfall and storms over the last few days.
Interesting to me that a country like Nicaragua is not part of the Paris Agreement, because they don't think that it goes far enough, and that for a little country like that to stand alone in that way, I think it's only Syria and indeed now, of course, the United States.
But the United States didn't leave because they didn't feel it went far enough. It's because Trump is basically a climate change denier. And, it's for me, that is a very profound thing, that you've moved from a leader like Obama, who I thought was a great leader.
Me too.
And helped with the Paris Accord, to Trump, who's undoing everything that Obama did, from healthcare to climate change.
It's pretty scary. I was watching with great interest what was happening with James Comey, the SAC chief of the FBI yesterday. And what do you take from that whole discussion or questioning that he underwent yesterday afternoon?
Well, I think that Comey came across as a human being, because he admitted his weaknesses in when somebody said, well, why didn't you say to Trump that you can't ask me questions like that? And he said, because, I didn't. And he admitted to his weakness. So he comes across as a real human being. He certainly came across for me as a very good guy.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say Trump, in all his declarations, comes across as somebody who thinks he's supreme. He doesn't think he has any faults. So, I don't know how this thing is going to play out, because there is a proper investigation into the whole sort of deal that Russia interfered in the elections, and maybe some of the current administration were involved. But I would say there's now a 50-50 on Trump getting impeached during his presidency.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that somebody like James Comey, who served under Obama, where one is assuming, if Obama is like that in private as well as in public, that he had that he abided by the rules of engagement as far as the FBI and government are concerned. Because you're quite right. Comey said, this is the first time a president has ever asked me the kind of questions and the critical thing was to ask Trump asking everybody to leave the room. Yes.
And then say to Comey, I've forgotten exactly what it was, but I'm hopeful that that whoever
be loyal. I think.
That you've got to be loyal, and I'm hopeful you're going to drop the case against Flynn or something like that.
Yes.
But I mean, the very fact that he asked everybody to leave the room it's all going to come down to he said.
Yes.
And the question I would ask as an advocate is, why did you ask everybody to leave the room?
Yes. Exactly. Do you think, we all remember those tapes during Nixon's era. Are there no longer, are people not taped in the Oval Office anymore?
I don't know. Nobody knows whether the tape exists or not.
Well, exactly. But, you've got somebody like Trump who's saying that he'd better not hope that there are tapes, of what he said. And he said, well, I hope there are. And it's quite interesting, because it takes you straight back to the Nixon era, doesn't it? Yeah.
It takes you straight back to Watergate. And, I actually did a seminar where I had quite a few, a webinar with quite a few Americans. And basically Trump has split America completely, from those who absolutely love him because he's such an anti-establishment guy, to those who absolutely hate him because he's undoing all the legacy of Obama.
Yes.
And in terms of, our flags, we have this one flag which we call the red flag, which is essentially three components. It's Russia, China, and North Korea.
Yes.
And vis-a-vis Russia, I think that the idea that Trump and Putin are friends, I just don't see it that way.
Don't you?
I don't see it at all.
No.
I think that there could be some incident involving maybe Syria or something like that, which could put them at loggerheads.
Yeah.
Certainly, China has come out as the leader on climate change now in hooking up with India and the European Union. And of course, Trump is going on about the cheapness of Chinese goods. But if he starts a protectionist war, then we're going to have the depression of the 1930s again. And North Korea, you've got two leaders who are totally impulsive, and it could turn into a very nasty war. And of course, the real victim will be South Korea, and particularly Seoul, because it's only 56 kilometers below the DMZ.
It's a very scary
separating
area.
North and South Korea.
Yeah. If James Comey is to be believed, then Russia did try to influence that last election in the States. And I'm still not entirely sure how they would have done that. And I don't think that's been discussed or revealed in any way. But he was very adamant about it.
Through social media, fake news, And obviously, even though the Americans said it made no difference to the actual voting results, hacking into the actual machines that count the votes. Yeah.
But Clem, when you look at that, there's particularly a company in London who looks at the profile of people on Facebook, on social media, in say the States or also in the UK, and who send custom-made messages to those people during election time, and they exist. Well, I suppose it is very different, but when you've got one side doing that to influence a vote, is there anything wrong with a side, a Conservative Party or Trump's party, who is there anything wrong with that happening, and what's to stop another country from doing something similar? And if that is the influence that Russia has brought to bear, then we're all open to it, surely. There's no real subterfuge to it, because it's there.
Absolutely.
We're there for the taking, if you like.
It's a flag. No, it's a real flag, because it's cyber terrorism of sorts. But the fact is, we're moving into this world where people can influence events through being very good hackers, and through social media, starting, fake news campaigns, doing all this kind of stuff. And, it obviously does influence elections, and it influenced the American election, and it influenced the election yesterday in the UK. So the game has changed, and that's the whole point of the flags, it's identifying those forces that are changing the game.
We've covered on this programme a couple of weeks ago the possible disappearance of the middle classes because of automation, because of various factors that exist in the world today. Do you see that as a likely scenario?
Sorry, disappearance
of the middle classes.
Absolutely. I don't see the disappearance of the middle classes. No, I see the obviously the continuing disappearance of unskilled jobs, because last century big business employed hundreds of thousands of people, and even for the skilled people, you just had to go to get fairly decent school results, university results, you waved your CV, you got a job. Yeah. But those days have completely passed, and young people face a completely different job market, where most of the opportunities lie in becoming an entrepreneur or joining a small business. And yes, you can still become a doctor or an engineer or join the civil service, but those jobs simply are not there in the quantities that they were in the last century. But have schools and universities adapted their curricula to produce young people more attuned to the idea of becoming entrepreneurs? The answer is absolutely not. And that's why we talk about foxes, because foxes identify the flags with their bright eyes, but then they act with agility in coping with the challenges of the flag. Yeah.
So, look, going forward, perhaps with regard to university degrees, for instance, what we're looking at, or we've discussed on this programme in the past, is the fact that perhaps the university degree is not as important as repurposing yourself annually, and your ability to forget what you knew before in order to learn what you're now going to need to know is absolutely imperative.
Yeah,
for employment.
Absolutely, which means having an entrepreneurial mindset, that you've got to reinvent yourself. I mean, it was quite interesting. Bruce Whitfield went to hear Warren Buffett speaking in Omaha, and what became plain to him in conversations in the taxis was that most people in Omaha have 2 or 3 jobs, from working for Uber to working in a restaurant to whatever it is. Yeah. So all these hundreds of thousands of jobs being created in the United States are not like those jobs, 50 to 100 years ago, where you joined a big company, you got a pension, you did this, and you had one job. Those days have changed, and you cannot control a flag when it starts going up. You've got to adapt to it.
Yeah, it's more than job sharing, isn't it? But we were talking about that some 20 years ago, in fact.
And of course, you've got, people are working from home, they're working different hours. And the other flag that I've talked about is lifestyle change. Both husband and wife work now. And so it's very different to the old days. And therefore, you've got lifestyle changes going on. Indeed, one of our friends went to pick up a kid at Joburg School because her daughter's gone, her son and daughter are away. And she's looking after kids. She goes to the school, and all the other people picking up kids are grandparents.
Yes. Yes, that's right. They look after the children.
They look after the children.
Yeah,
so
they do.
It's a huge lifestyle change where both husband and wife work, where they're possibly doing, more than one job each. Yeah, this is the job market of today, and so therefore our education system has to reflect that.
Yeah, so we're as good as we are at behaving like that fox that you chat about. Clem, we've completely run out of time. As always, it's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you. You've got a website, haven't you? Is there? So it's just
but let me just tell you, you introduced me purely as a futurist. I was a professional musician before I joined the company.
I'd forgotten that about you.
I was a rock musician. Me and a friend, we earned £40 a night in the early 60s in London, playing all over. I think we actually shared a gig with the Rolling Stones.
Yes, I remember this. Yes, you and Mick Jagger, you were like this. I'm crossing my fingers.
We didn't play with them, but we shared a gig with them, yeah.
Clem, you never cease to amaze everybody, and just continue doing that. And I'm sure that everybody was sitting up and listening with great interest. As always, www.clemsunter.co.za is how you look up. And I know that you're doing various things on
my name. Just Google my name, and you'll get to what I'm.
And 100 things, including his life previously as a rock star. That's Clem Sunter. Thanks for chatting today. Take care, Clem.
Thanks. Bye-bye.